Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come and eat.
So, the title of this teaching is How to Stay Tuned into Elohim Through His Creation. And we're building on this theme. I guess there's somebody that really need to hear this message. Anyway, and this is an important message because as we go through the floods and the fires of life and things happen around us, swirling vortex, the whirlwinds of our existence, and whether it be in our personal life or extended in our family or the world in general, the forces and powers of Antichrist, anti-Messiah, just as the book of Revelation and Matthew 24 and elsewhere predicted, are closing in. People are being persecuted, believers in the Bible and followers of the Messiah, and while it may not be knocking on our door, it is coming to a theater near you. It's called the Great Tribulation, and then you have the wrath of Elohim, and those are all other subjects. And we're going to look at how to stay connected or tuned into Elohim through nature, which will help us to weather the storms. And this is kind of one aspect of creating what I call a God bubble around us. That we, or our spiritual force field, or David called it, going to Yehovah like a high tower or a fortress. Or maybe abiding under the shadow of his wings, or maybe in the Holy of Holies. This is where we're going with all of this, and we're going to be teaching more about that later on. How to do a better job of being though you're in the world, but not of the world. And I want to go to the book of Job. Job was a man that had everything. And one day he lost it all. I mean, everything materially, and he was blessed, and he was the most righteous man on the earth. And he lost it all. Except the wife that told him to curse God and die. She lost it all too, and she was pretty discouraged. And she said, the prevailing idea of that era was that if you do what's right, you will be blessed. If you don't do what's right, you will be cursed. So, and that's why she's, I suspect, said, curse God and die. What's the point of serving him? And that's basically what his three friends said. They were his three theologian friends who had gone to Bible college, seminary, yeshiva. They had their PhDs, their masters in theology, their PhDs in theology, and in whatever else. They had their titles, rabbi, priest, pope, reverend, whatever. And they brought to the table in the most eloquent terms the conventional snapshot religious views of Elohim of that day. Basically, the idea was if you do what's right, you'll be blessed. And if you don't do what's right, you'll be cursed. So therefore, Job, since you're being cursed, obviously you haven't done anything. You have not done things that are right. That's why you are suffering the consequences. And Job, of course, well, I've done everything. Well, he was suffering from a little bit of self-righteousness, maybe a little bit of pride. He had his own issues, but he knew that what they were saying was not right. And they go on and on and on for like 30-some chapters. These were high literary pieces of work that these men put together and presented. This was poetry. They didn't just get off and shoot off their mouth. They literally thought these things out and presented it in high literature type formats. And anyway, finally they could not break through to Job. Job remained where he was at in his understandings, and they refused to let go of their theologies. Along comes Elihu, who begins to move. He's the fourth friend, a younger fellow. He begins to move things in the right direction, and kind of takes Job to task for some things, takes the three friends to task for some things, and begins to point things to Elohim. Then if we go to chapter 38, Job chapter 38, after men's theologies have run their course, men's ideas of who they think Elohim is, what they think the meaning of life is, and all of that stuff. They've been through all their systematic theologies, all of their rabbinical writings, all of their Christian theological, volumes and books and libraries with all of their mind of man stuff. And there was good stuff in there too. It wasn't all bad. Then we read in chapter 38, Then Jehovah answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? This is his summation of the theologians and their viewpoints of the day. Now, I'm not against theologians. I'm for truth. I don't care whether it's a Jewish theologian, a Christian theologian, or some other theologian. If truth is truth, and it will stand on its own. I learned biblical things from my recently departed dog. And we can learn things from a lot of different sources. But that's not the primary source of truth. Pardon me. So Jehovah says, Who is this that darkens counsel without words of knowledge? I'm not going to go into the meanings of darkens, but it's clouds and obscures. Basically, he said, and later on we find out these guys really ticked Elohim off. He said, Job, you need to go make sacrifice for them, lest I in my rage, visit judgments upon them or whatever, really take them to task. This was his view of theology. So, when Job was going through faith testing trials, he was searching for answers as to why. When the theological explanations failed to answer Job's deepest questions, and he finally came to the end of himself and the end of man's humanistic reasons, Elohim answered him out of the whirlwind. And did Elohim answer his questions? Why me, Lord? Why is this on me? What is the meaning of all this? Did he answer that? Elohim has his own ways of answering things. You may ask him a question, and you may not get exactly the answer you thought. You might get something different, or something that seems totally unrelated. How many times do we read in the scriptures, like the Gospels, for example, where the people ask him, Yeshua, a question, and he answers it in a way that doesn't even seem to make sense? Or he'll answer it and then all of a sudden jump over the next sentence to something that seems totally unrelated to anything. How many of you have encountered that? Like, what does this have to do with this? But it's all part of the same discussion. And years later, you're reading that for the umpteenth time, you realize, whoa, there's a deeper truth here. See, he gives us answers that makes us search things out. With our Greco-Roman mindset, we want to have everything laid out in syllogistic, step logic order, like a mathematical equation. And that's not how Hebraic thought works. It draws you in and makes you think. And in the process, you discover things that you didn't know were there, and it brings you higher. Anybody finding that out as you go through this Hebraic walk? Yeah. You're missing a couple pieces of the puzzle, and when those pieces are put in, suddenly it changes the whole picture. As wonderful as the message of the gospel is that the Christian church teaches, they're missing some pieces of the puzzle. And when the pieces of the puzzle are put in from a Hebraic perspective, a pro-Torah perspective, suddenly it expands the message of the gospel out to much bigger and much more incredible than they even dreamed of. I was having a discussion with a brother about that this morning. And that's what makes me fall in love with Yeshua. It's like there's so much more to learn, and we're just still little children scratching the surface. So Yehovah answered Job out of this whirlwind. I've always imagined this whirlwind, like he just dropped down, you know, this thing's, you know, this vortex. He might have. But that's not how, in another place, he answered one of the major prophets of the Bible, Elijah. Yehovah was not in the whirlwind. He was in the still small voice. So I tend to think that it wasn't that Yehovah dropped down in a whirlwind, a literal whirlwind, or a dust devil or something like that, but he answered Job in the whirlwind of Job's emotional and mental state. Because Job was tied up in knots. He had boils all over his skin, and he had nothing. And he was confused. And a lot of us find ourselves in similar places in life at different times and places. And when we come to the end of ourselves and let go and let God, as the saying goes, suddenly something opens up. But we got to come to the end of ourselves and let it go and get almost desperate. We're going to talk about this desperation in a little bit. He came to the end of himself, and how did Yehovah answer him? It wasn't, well, you know, the reason that you're going through this or going through this is because of this and this. What did he do? He answered him in a way that totally seems irrelevant to anything. Where were you when I made the heavens and hung the earth and threw the stars out there? And can you explain the whales and behemoth and what the goats and the mountain lions and the ostrich and the clouds and the rain and the sun and the moon and all that? And he goes on for about like three chapters or so. 4 chapters. What? What is this all about? The answer is, to understand the deeper questions of life, Yehovah is saying, go to my creation. Skip the Bible colleges, skip the yeshivas, skip the College of the Cardinals, skip all of that. Not that you can't learn something there, but that's not where you're going to find it. Not the deeper things. What you have to do is you got to quiet your soul down. This whirlwind of emotions, quiet it down. Everybody turn to Psalm 131. Psalm 131. This is what David says here. You know, David was not, you know, there's only 4 educated men in the entire Bible, formally educated. Do you realize that? Only 4. Moses, he was schooled in all the learning of Egypt. Daniel, most likely, he was raised up, went to Babylon as a child, and as a child slave, and he was most likely schooled in all the things of Babylon. He was an advisor to several kings, Nebuchadnezzar, Belteshazzar, and Cyrus. You would have been schooled in the things of Babylon to be an advisor to the king, not just 1, but 3. And we have Luke was a physician, and he most likely learned that. Who was the 4th one? There was another one. Who? Paul. Thank you. Paul, of course. Sat at the feet of Gamaliel. Thank you. 4. Now, I'm not against or for college or academic learning. No, I've got my share of it, but I'm for truth. David was not formally educated, but he said, because I know your Torah, I have more knowledge than my teachers. So he must have had some teachers. So he went through something. But Psalm 31. This is where Job came to. Lord, verse 1. Yehovah, my heart is not haughty, nor my eyes lofty. Job had to get his attention off of himself and onto something else. Neither do I concern myself with great matters. You know, let's just skip all the theology, folks. I'm not saying it's all bad, but let's not get all caught up in men's reasonings and theology. Okay, here it is. Surely I have quieted my soul, my mind, my will, and my emotions that are running rampant. My mind and my emotions. And Job was in the vortex of his mind and his emotions, and his friends were just fueling the fire. They were fueling the fire of his mind, and his wife was fueling the fire of his emotions. Curse God and die. Like a weaned child with his mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me. What does that have to do with anything? Well, my wife and I have raised 4 children. And what do babies do when they're hungry? Wah! What do they do when they have a dirty diaper? Wah! What do they do when they've got some other need or something, you know, upsets their little world? Wah! But by the time they're weaned, they're able to maybe feed themselves or you know, they're not so emotionally needy and unstable. And that's what David is saying here. Guys, stop acting like little babies. Grow up. I have grown up. And I'm not going wah every time somebody stubs my toe, or I get my face slapped, or I get, you know, somebody tweaks my ego. Just quiet yourself down, or I don't have the answer to life or whatever. Quiet yourself down. Sit back. And get yourself weaned off the tit of your mother that changes your diaper and gives you a drink of milk. Grow up. Church, time to grow up. Stop, get off of the milk that you've been being fed by your pastors that are giving you baby food. Every time you go, wow, you go running to your pastor or to your rabbi or to your priest or to your reverend or to your holy man or your guru or to YouTube or to some internet ministry or to this or that. I'm not saying that's all bad. Grow up. And that's what Yehovah was telling Job. It's time to grow up. Verse 3, Psalm 131. O Israel, hope in the Lord. Put your trust in Him. Go running to Him. Humble yourself like a child and come running to Him. Of such is the kingdom. So we've got to come to the end of ourselves, and when we're in the pit of life, we got to look up. And then maybe that's when Elohim will break through with His voice, and we will begin to hear Him. When we quiet ourselves down and we can hear, as Elijah did, past the avalanche and the whirlwind, he'll hear this breeze of the Ruach, the still small voice of Yehovah Elohim, coming quietly into our spirit man, which we talked about yesterday, not into the commotion of our emotions. I like that, commotions of our emotions. I have to remember that one. Or the you know, the vicissitudes of our emotions, or all of the perturbations and the jumbled thoughts of our minds. But we quiet our soul man down and get quiet and open up our spirit man and release our spirit to hear Elohim. And then we will hear the voice, the still small voice of Elohim. And then the still small voice coming into our personal spirit can then go and tell our emotions, our mind, will, and emotions, this is the way, walk ye in it. This is what you need to do. Think this, don't think that. Feel this, don't feel that. And we are then getting lined up with Elohim. Let's talk about the voice of Elohim. after we quiet ourselves down. I'm not going to turn to these, but the Bible says the voice of Elohim is like many waters. Ezekiel 43 verse 2, Revelation 1 verse 15, and Revelation 14 verse 2, and 19 verse 6. 4 scriptures that talk about the voice of Elohim like waters. Like waters. It's a beautiful, beautiful analogy. You listen to waters, like this river down here, especially that have where there's maybe ripples, where there's a stream. It's very soothing and calming, isn't it? Even in the rapids, you listen to them and it's soothing and calming. The voice in Ezekiel 43 verse 2 through 3, it says, well, let me just say that Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 43 verse 2, it says he was by the river Kibar when he received a vision. So he actually went to this calming place where the voice of Elohim was like many waters, where he received prophetic vision. That's why we're blessed to have a river here, literally at the end of this path. The wonderful Deschutes River in Central Oregon here, where we can go. And that's why I've encouraged you. There's a reason I said go to the river. It's a biblical thing to do. Tie this in with the idea of Psalm 1 verse 3, where it says, the righteous man, the righteous Torah obedient man will be like a tree planted by the rivers. The Bible talks about a river of life that flows from the throne of Elohim and from the temple of Elohim, and the river of life that has the trees for the healing of the nations there in the book of Revelation. And we will be like a tree where we can get nourishment from the water, and we will not faint in that day when the sun comes out, because we got a source of water. And we know that source of water is the Torah, it's the Spirit, it's the Ruach, it's Yeshua. The voice of Elohim can be like many waters, and it can also be like an army that's standing still. Ezekiel 1 verse 24. Now I can't say that I've seen too many armies standing still. I don't know exactly what that's like, so maybe that's something we think about. Maybe it's just a quiet rumble of men's voices just talking quietly. I don't know. Job, it's also like thunder. The Hebrew word for thunder is the word kol, K-O-L, and we see that in Job 37 verses 4 through 5, Psalm 29, and we also see this where one of the 3 times where Yehovah the Father thundered down from heaven to Yeshua, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased, listen to him. But in John 12 verse 28 and 29, it said some people heard the voice of Elohim, and others thought they heard thunder. So we learn from that his voice can be like thunder, rumbling thunder. Now, let's talk about going back to nature. Because this is what Yehovah instructed Job to do. To learn about him and learn about the meaning of life by going to nature. When we go into nature, we need to learn to attune ourselves to hearing the voice of Yahweh, for he reveals some of the deep things about himself and the mysteries of the Godhead through nature. Paul understood this in Romans 1 verse 20. Romans 1 verse 20, and it says, for since the creation of the world, Yehovah's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. He's talking about people in general. The mysteries, the word mystery is the Greek word mysterion, which means things that the average people are blinded to, and only those initiated into a certain understanding will understand. And we understand that that's initiation by the Ruach HaKodesh, the Spirit of Elohim coming into a person because they've been born again from above. So his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. I think this helps us to understand why Yehovah answered Job the way he did. He's saying, if you want to learn about me and why I do things the way I do and learn about cause and effect, learn about my character and nature, go to nature and study and learn about me. That's what I see here. Because we really cannot comprehend who Elohim is. Our minds are too finite. As I've said many times, the finite cannot comprehend the infinite. Our minds are not to that point. We can't do that. If we could comprehend who Elohim really is in his fullness, we would be on a level equal to him. But we aren't, and we can't. So he says, go to nature. Go to the trees, the mountains, the rivers, the stars, the galaxies, the chipmunks, the rainbows, the clouds, the earth, geology, chemistry, biology, physics, whatever. And you will learn about me. They all point to him because he created them. And they all are reflections of his character and his nature. And we see the laws of science and nature a reflection of the laws of spiritual laws. And we could talk a long time about that. But they all reflect who he is. The Gospels tell us that Yeshua often went into the wilderness, to a mountain or to a garden or some quiet place to be alone with the Father. He left the crowds. He left the city. He didn't go even to the temple to be alone with the Father. He had to get away from the crowds, the noise, the city, the spiritual confusion of it all, to get back in tune with heaven. As much as he loved the people, as much as he had a heart for the people, he gave his life, he had to get away. He had to go on sabbatical once in a while. He got burned out. In Matthew 4:1, he went into a wilderness for 40 days. In Matthew 6:6, he talked about going into your prayer closet to pray. So you may not necessarily be able to get out of the city, but you can go to a quiet place, a prayer closet in your home. In Matthew 14:23, he went to a mountain. In Matthew 26:36, a garden on a mountain. That would be Gethsemane. In Mark 1:12, he went to the wilderness. Mark 1:35, he went to a solitary place. Mark 6:46 and Luke 4:2, he went to a deserted place, away from people. In Luke 5:16, he went into the wilderness. In Luke 6:12, he went to a mountain. And Luke 22:39, a garden on a mountain. Luke 6:15, a mountain. Yeshua never went to pray, to be alone with Elohim. Making corrections. Here we go. Eventually I'm going to publish this, but I got to do the corrections as I go. He never went to pray, to be alone with Elohim, or to hear the Father's voice. He never went to a church. Well, I guess they didn't exist. He never went to a synagogue. It's not recorded. And he didn't go to a building. Unless it was in one's personal prayer closet, it might have been in your house. There's no examples of him going to these places. And yet, this is where a lot of people go to pray. Or to hear the voice of Elohim. And this is not what our Savior and our Master did. Also, notice, when Yeshua did go to a church or synagogue in his day, he didn't go there to get closer to the Father. He didn't, and I'm not against that. I'm not saying you can't go to a church to get closer to the Father. You can find the Father in the middle of a witch's coven or a satanic meeting. People, it happens. But for mature believers, he's saying, if we're going to follow Yeshua, there's another road, maybe a higher road even. Okay? And that's what I'm trying to point us to. Open up our understanding by pointing us to the Messiah. So when he was in a church, what was he doing there? He was teaching. Okay, great. It's a great place to do teaching because people come together, they can sit down, and it's dry, it's warm in the wintertime, and so on and so on. Okay, that's fine. And there's chairs and all of that. He was there also to rebuke the hypocritical leaders because that's where they hang out, is in buildings. Because they're monuments to, many times monuments to themselves. Or to heal the sick. Or to cast demons out of someone. But it's not there that he went to hang out with his disciples or to be alone with the Father. I'm not saying you can't, but I'm just giving you what the Gospels say. The early church did not go to a synagogue, or they did initially go to the synagogue to learn about Moses. The Jerusalem Council in Acts 15:21 instructed them to do that. But once they got kicked out of the synagogue, they didn't go to buildings anymore. There is an example where they rented a school. But most of the time they met in homes in the book of Acts. And one time they went by a river. Why? Because nature and Yovel's creation helped to aid man in getting in touch with and hearing the voice of Elohim. Interestingly, Yehovah, when he took the children of Israel out of Egypt, Egypt was a picture of this world. He didn't move them to Babylon or to, pick some other city, Jericho, or whatever city in Canaan. Where did he take them? He took them into the wilderness, into the cleanness and the purity of the midbar. That's the Hebrew word for wilderness. And the Hebrew word for wilderness has within it midbar, M-I-D-B-A-R. It has the Hebrew word D-B-A-R, debar. Dalet, Bet, and Resh. The three Hebrew letters. And that is the word in Hebrew that means word. He literally took the Israelites out of Egypt, out of the city, out of civilization. He took them into a wilderness so they could, to the foot of Mount Sinai, where they heard. He took them into the debar to where they could hear the midbar to hear the debar, the word of Elohim. Where they heard his voice like thunder, like coal at the foot of Mount Sinai. Where he showed them the way to walk. They got saved there at Passover with the blood of the lamb on the doorpost. And once they got saved, that's a picture of the Abrahamic covenant. He brought them to the base of Mount Sinai, where now they're saved. This is how you're supposed to walk. And he made a covenant with them called the Mosaic or the Sinaitic covenant there at the base of Mount Sinai between Exodus 19 and Exodus 24. And he formulated a covenant. They said, I do 3 times. They witnessed against themselves. And he said, if you obey me and keep my commands, I will bless you. If not, I will curse you. And he married them. And we've talked a lot about this. I've done a lot of teachings about that. And the marriage covenant was formulated with blood. And it was written down in a book. We see this. Moses was the officiating mediator. And we see that in Ezekiel 34. Exodus 24. And they even had a marriage supper where the elders of Israel, the priests/elders, got together and they had a feast there at the base of Mount Sinai. We see the whole picture laid out there. And that's where they heard the debar, like thunder, of Elohim. And they said, we don't want to hear your voice anymore. They freaked them out. And after that, Moses, when he wanted to get instructions subsequent to that from Elohim, where did he go? He went into the tabernacle. He went into the Holy of Holies, under the glory cloud, to hear the word of Elohim, to receive more of the Torah. And he went into the Kadosh HaKadoshim, which also had another name called the oracle. Because the oracle means a divine voice. And the Hebrew word for oracle is the word divir. D'-V-E-R. D-E-E-R, to transliterate it into English. And there you have the word debar again. It's still the same letters, Dalet, Bet, Resh. So he took Israel out of Egypt into the wilderness, Midbar, where they heard his voice, and then he gave Moses further instructions in the tabernacle, in the Devir, or the Debar. And the book of Deuteronomy, the Hebrew name is Devarim, or Debarim, depending on how you want to pronounce it, because it means words. That's the Hebrew name for... So, if you want to hear the voice of Elohim, the bottom line is, you got to get clearly, or more clearly, get out of the things of men, out into nature, out into a quiet place where you're more likely to be able to hear the word of Elohim. And that's what Yehovah did with his people, to get them cleaned up and prepared and educated in his ways of how to walk in Torah and follow that glory cloud. We know that's a picture of Yeshua. And eventually then be prepared to enter into the promised land. And we are in the wilderness of the peoples right now, in our own spiritual wilderness, being prepared to meet Yeshua at his second coming, so he can then, the second Yehoshua, or the second Moshe, but Yeshua, or Joshua, to put it in English terms, can then lead us into the spiritual promise, the promised land of our spiritual inheritance, where we will be his bride, ruling and reigning with him forever. Now, you can write this down. I'm not going to go through there, but Psalm 29 talks about the attributes. I think there's 9 attributes. I don't remember how many, of Yehovah's voice. And when you study that, you realize his voice is like thunder, and it does a lot of things. It affects, and again, it talks about what it, maybe we'll just touch it real briefly. It talks about what his voice does and how it affects nature. And if you look at this, you see his voice is over the waters. Waters is a Hebrew word, a metaphor representing peoples. His voice is powerful, verse 4. His voice is full of majesty, verse 4. The voice of the Yehovah breaks the cedars. The cedars of Lebanon were the tall, big trees. In Hebraic thought, cedars of Lebanon represented the pride of human achievement and just the human, stubborn, prideful nature of man. His voice will break human pride and stubbornness. Verse 7, the voice of Yehovah divides the flames of fire. Reminds me of spiritual empowerment. The Israelites they're in Acts 2, on the day of Pentecost, cloven tongues of fire came down upon the Israelites. I mean, they were Israelites, but upon the Jews there on the day of Pentecost. And they were empowered with spirit and truth. We could go on. The voice of the Lord makes the deer give birth. You know, there are lessons to be learned from studying this passage about our own spiritual walk and how to hear his voice and what his voice sounds like. So, coming into the presence of Elohim through an encounter with nature is, you have to sometimes go through mental, emotional, and a spiritual wilderness battle and a crushing before Yehovah, before you have an encounter or a breakthrough encounter with Yehovah. What we might call the dark night of the soul, a wrestling. You wrestle with your mind. You wrestle with your emotions. You wrestle with your will until they get you nowhere, and you got to come to the end of yourself and say, I give up. I surrender. Lord, I give it all to you. What do you have to say about it? How many of you have done that? You've you come to trials in your life, and you've plotted it out. You've had the internal dialogues with yourself. And maybe you've argued with your wife or your husband or other people. You've been through it all, and finally you said, and you're getting nowhere fast, and you just say, okay, I give up. And you just get quiet, and then all of a sudden the answers come. Doors shut, doors open, things happen. You see a way of escape, you see enlightenment, and suddenly the joy comes and the blessing in his presence. This is what happened with Jacob when he wrestled with Jehovah in Job 32. That was the pre-incarnate Yeshua. He wrestled all night because he was in a tight spot. His brother Esau wanted to kill him, and he had an army waiting to kill Jacob as Jacob was coming back into the land of Canaan. And he had to wrestle. Jacob did a bunch of stuff. He divided his camp. He tried to appease his brother, and it wasn't working. And then he had this wrestling. Am I going to surrender my mind and my emotions to Elohim and receive the blessing? And he did. He received the blessing. He persevered. He prevailed. He hearkened to Jehovah's covenants. It was after he tried to bribe his brother and he divided his camp into two. If they kill one, then this one will survive and we're going to go a different way, and so forth and so on. After he tried all this human stuff, this emotional and mental stuff, he finally appealed to the covenant. And I think it's the first prayer in the Bible. Yehovah, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, my fathers, and my father and my grandfather. I appeal to your covenant. And then he wrestled. Am I going to surrender and submit to Elohim? And he came out of it with a blessing, and his physical man was wounded. He limped the rest of his life, and he came out with a new identity. He became Israel. Prevailer with Yah or Prince of El, prevailer with El or Prince of El, depending on how you want to interpret the meaning of Yisrael. So he went through that. Moses had to spend 40 years in the wilderness dying to himself after being a prince in Egypt before he was ready to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. So he had his wilderness experience where he had to die to everything he was before he could hear the voice of Elohim at the burning bush. The 23rd Psalm, I could do a whole teaching on this one. We all know it. But let's just quickly overview. This is like Job. I see Job in the 23rd Psalm. So everything is going well for the author. In this case, it was David. I mean, I know you're Yehovah. You lead me like a good shepherd by the still waters. You're feeding me. Everything's going great. And all of a sudden, boom, I'm in the valley of the shadow of death. Whoa, what happened here? That's like Job. Valley of the shadow of death. And my faith is being stretched. And I'm walking in the paths of righteousness. In verse 4, suddenly I'm in the valley of the shadow of death. And I'm learning about your rod and your staff. I was a shepherd on the farm that I was raised on, and we raised sheep. And we didn't have a rod and a staff. A rod was for a weapon to protect the sheep, and a staff was to guide the sheep so they wouldn't go astray. We didn't have a rod and a staff. We had fences, and we had a gun. It was my job to keep the fences up, to keep the sheep in and keep the predators out. And then if the predators did get in, we had a gun by the door, and we went and shot the predators. Okay? Well, we actually did that on the farm. And I killed a lot of predators for the sheep and the chickens and the other livestock. So I understand this. and Yehovah, as you go through this valley of shadow of death, this is his Job experience. And you learn about the provision of the Father, the protection and the guidance of the Father in the valley of the shadow of death when things aren't going very well. And then we wrestle and we struggle with the death. We lead through the valley, and he leads us through the valley. And when we come out the other side of the valley, guess what? You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. The Bible says, when your ways are pleasing to Yehovah, he makes even your enemies to be at peace with you. So either your enemies are at peace with you, or Yah just kind of judges your enemies and he takes them out of the picture. And now you have come through those that want to kill you, that whether it's people, situations, circumstances, whatever. And that's when the presence of Elohim comes. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runs over. And you're preparing a table before me like a wedding supper, fellowship, communion. And goodness, now I know and understand your goodness and mercy like I didn't when everything was hunky-dory in the pasture. And you lead me through these troubled waters. You're refining me, bringing me to a higher level in my spiritual walk. And it's there then that I get to really know who you are, and I can dwell. I got past all of this, my comfort zones, got stretched, got expanded my understanding. Your anointing comes, your revelation comes, fellowship with you at a higher level comes, and now I can dwell in the house of Elohim forever. That's just, to me, a picture of eternal life. This is exactly what Job went through. He didn't complain, he didn't die, he didn't give up in the valley of the shadow of death. He overcame. And when he emerged from the trial, he was brought to a higher level in his spiritual walk. He understood the comfort of Yehovah, the festive fellowship. He received a fresh anointing. And then he was able to then live in the house of Yehovah forever. And this is a cycle that many of us will go through over and over and over again. We go through this cycle as we are spiraling around and around, growing in our spiritual walk. And sometimes it's big trials, sometimes it's little trials. Hallelujah. So, all of these encounters that we see, whether it be Moses in the wilderness, or David, the 23rd Psalm, or Job, or Yeshua, when he'd go into the wilderness, Elijah, when he heard the still small voice, all of these man-made encounters, or Elohim man encounters, have something in common. Now, I don't know about the 23rd Psalm, but I'm thinking David was a shepherd. So whether he wrote the 23rd Psalm while he was a shepherd, or whether he did it when he was the king, I don't know. But it's still a bucolic pasture outdoor setting. You understand? The 23rd Psalm is. So all of these things have something in common. They occurred while one was alone with Yehovah in nature. You guys get that? In nature. When the world, like a toilet flushing, is swirling out of control on its way down to hell, literally, and you are powerless to do anything about it, turn to Yehovah's garden. Turn to nature. Turn to the Word, take your Bible with you, and go away from this stuff. Where did Yah plant human beings? At the beginning. In a city, surrounded by the things of men, in a church with steeples and altars and stained glass and all this other religious paraphernalia, or in a, whatever, any construction of man, some cathedral? No. He put him in a garden. A garden that was made by him, by Elohim. What can we learn from that? And where are we going to be planted when all is said and done? Not just Adam and Eve, but the whole family of Elohim. In the garden city of the New Jerusalem. It's still a garden, but a glorified city like we've never seen before, and it's going to come down from heaven. This is very interesting to me. I'm an outdoorsman, and I've been involved in horticulture, all of agriculture and horticulture my entire life. I went to college to try to get away from that, but Yah brought me right back into it. And I tend and care for trees and plants. And I grew up on a farm, and my dad had a nursery. He was a landscape contractor. We did estate gardening. We did landscape design. We did all kinds of things. And then I became an arborist, and I'm a certified arborist. And I've had a tree care company that I've owned and operated now for 30-some years. but I started my tree service when I was 12, 48 years ago, when I started doing it for pay. That's when I started caring for trees. I've been doing this all my life, trees and plants and shrubs. And so, and gardening is one of my #1 passions and hobbies. And I do it for other people. I work for a lot of really nice homes, $1 million homes, nice homes where I do, again, trees and shrubs. I'm not mowing their grass or that kind of thing. There's other people that do that. But I come home after a day of work and I work in my own yard. I have a kind of a Japanese style garden where I prune things in a Japanese style, and I have, you know, I'm inspired by the Japanese because I think they're the best gardeners on the planet. And someday I hope to go visit Japan with my wife, and we get to see some of these things. But in the meanwhile, in our city of Portland, we have the #1 Japanese gardens in North America. They're rated the #1 out of 300. So I get to go up there and be inspired. And I come home and bring ideas and put that in. But so I'm into gardening, but so is Yehovah. What are the first 5 Torah commandments in the Bible, folks? Have you ever thought about that? These, I believe, are the key to a joyful, wonderful, fulfilled life. What are they? #1, Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful and multiply. Sex and procreation. In the construct of marriage and the family. Be fruitful and multiply. Have sex, raise up a family, and enjoy the family. Family and marriage. #2, Genesis 1:28. Second commandment in the Torah. Genesis 1:28. Govern or exercise stewardship over the animals. So, being a farmer, animal husbandry, taking care of the creation. That's #2. So family, marriage, sex. #2, have pets, have animals, take care of them. Animal husbandry. And what is #3? Genesis 2:15. Tend and keep the garden. That was the 3rd commandment that Yehovah Elohim gave to the Israelites, or to Adam and Eve. Tend and keep the garden. It's the 3rd commandment, is be out in nature and enjoy nature and learn about me in nature and by doing it. The 4th commandment is Genesis 2:17. Do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Tree of life, yes. Knowledge of good and evil, no. Do not feed from the mind of man. That's the tree called secular humanism. The mind of man. Be out there in the garden learning about me. But don't learn about me from the mind, through the mind of man, through the spirit, but not the mind of man. Doesn't mean that there aren't teachers that are spirit-filled. Yeah, teacher, apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, those are part of the fivefold ministry. The Kohanim, or the priests in ancient Israel, were the ones that, and the Levites taught the Israelites about the Torah and the word of Elohim. There is a place for that. But I'm not talking about going to secular sources for knowledge about Elohim, because they don't get it, and they never will until they receive the spirit of Elohim and they know the word of Elohim. And in the 5th commandment, Genesis 2:24, marriage and family. A man shall leave his wife or his parents and marry his, cleave to his wife. So again, marriage and family is at the center of this. It's the beginning and end, and everything in between. Ideally, what should a family be doing? A husband and wife, make a family and have garden and raise animals. Kind of like what you guys are doing. That's the ideal. That's what the Torah says to do. And I know that's not popular. In our society, women have to go off and become captains of industry and this and that. That's not the ideal. That's not what Yehovah, and men have to be going here and going there and all that. That's not what he created. That's not the ideal. What I'm doing is more the ideal as an arborist. I'm not saying everybody has to do that, but I just fell into that because I was raised with that. And there's nothing wrong with trades and all this stuff, but there is a way that brings one closer to Elohim, I believe, and this is the way. So, when humans dedicate themselves to fulfilling these commands, there is a basic, deep joy and fulfillment that will occur in one's life that can be achieved in no other way. I'm talking about the first 5 commandments of the Bible. Being in nature and tending the garden is a key to finding Elohim and discovering the deep mysteries about him. By way of quick review, Romans 1:20. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. The other 4 Torah laws of Genesis 1 and 2 are also fundamental keys to happiness, joy, and blessing that will bring a person to an understanding of Yehovah as well. Sexual relations with your spouse, bearing and raising children, caring for animals, marriage and family, and abstaining from the tree of knowledge or secular humanism. Fulfilling these 5 laws in one's life is a key to staying connected to Elohim, staying grounded spiritually, and not getting sucked into the technocratic, mind-controlling, enslaving matrix of Babylon the Great, the New World Order that Satan and his human minions are endeavoring to impose on humanity like an invisible net. We're going to talk more about that, I don't know, maybe tomorrow or the next day. In final conclusion, about 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, 3 years ago at Gold Beach, Sukkot Northwest, I gave a teaching on the healing power of Yehovah's creation. Anybody remember that one? Maybe a couple of you. And I quoted some studies that show that when we go out into nature, this is from science, we are in a better state. This is backing what the Bible teaches. The National Geographic magazine, January 2016, had an article entitled, "This is Your Brain on Nature" by Florence Williams. And I quote, cite this. David Strayer, a cognitive psychologist at the University of Utah, takes students into nature on what he calls a 3-day effect. On one expedition into nature, a group of participants performed 50% better on creative problem-solving tasks after 3 days of wilderness backpacking. In England, researchers from the University of Exeter Medical School recently analyzed mental health data from 10,000 city dwellers and used high-resolution mapping to track where the subjects had lived over 18 years. They found that people living near more green spaces report less mental distress. In 2009, a team of Dutch researchers found a lower incidence of 15 diseases, including depression, anxiety, heart disease, diabetes, asthma, and migraines in people who lived within about a half a mile of a green space. In 2015, an international team overlaid health questionnaires responses from more than 31,000 Toronto residents onto a map of the city, block by block. Those living on blocks with more trees showed a boost in heart and metabolic health equivalent to what one would experience from a $20,000 gain in yearly income. Richard Mitchell, an epidemiologist at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, did a large study and found less death and diseases in people who live near parks or other green spaces, even if they didn't use them. What Mitchell and other researchers suspect is that nature works primarily by lowering stress. In Sweden, physician Matilda Vandenbosch found that after a stressful math task, subjects' heart rate variability, which decreases with stress, returned to normal more quickly when they sat through 15 minutes of nature scenes and bird songs in a 3D virtual reality room than when they sat in a plain room. Here in Oregon, at the Snake River now this is all from the National Geographic article I'm quoting. At the Snake River Correctional Institution in Eastern Oregon, officers there report calmer behavior in solitary confinement prisoners who exercise 40 minutes several days a week in a blue room where nature videos are played compared with those who exercise in a gym without videos. A 15-minute walk in the woods causes measurable changes in physiology. Japanese researchers led by, oh, help me here. I can get this one. Yoshifumi Miyazaki at Chiba University, forgive me, Toshi and Kamiko, for murdering these names, sent 84 subjects to stroll in 7 different forests while the same number of volunteers walked around city centers. The forest walkers hit a relaxation jackpot. Overall, they showed a 16% decrease in stress and hormone cortisol, a 2% drop in blood pressure, and a 4% drop in heart rate. And then finally, according to the U.S. Forest Service, a brochure entitled Trees Pay Us Back from March 2011, their studies found that tree-filled neighborhoods report lower levels of domestic violence, are safer and more sociable, reduce stress of body and mind, and decrease need for medication and speed recovery times. Also, tree-lined commercial districts and shopping areas are more frequent shopping occurs, shopping trips are longer, and people are willing to pay more for parking. People are willing to spend 12% more for goods. So if you own a store or a business, plant more trees around there, your income will go up. According to the Center for Urban Horticulture at the University of Washington College of Forest Resources, from a brochure published in 1998 entitled Trees in Business Districts, Positive Effects on Consumer Behavior, they found that trees are good for business. Just like what the U.S. Forest Service discovered, studies show that consumers respond positively to shopping environments having a healthy urban forest. When surveyed, customers in treed and landscape districts rated amenity and comforts 80% higher, interaction with merchants 15% higher, quality of products 30% higher, and people are willing to pay 11% more for products from stores in treed and landscape areas over those that were not. I hope some lights came on. I hope some people were encouraged by what I've presented here from the Bible and from modern science about the value of nature as being a way to not only connect to Elohim, but then as a result for better health and better well-being in life. That was the purpose of this teaching. And now we're going to dismiss ourselves, and it's lunchtime. You can go have lunch, or you can do what you want, but before we come back together again, this is going to be your assignment. This is going to sound like a repeat, but what I want you to do is take some time sometime this afternoon and go back out into nature again, preferably by the river. And I want you to pick up a rock or a piece of stick or something and say, this represents my mind, my will, and my emotions. This represents my soul, man. And I want you to throw it into the river and say, you are no longer in control of my life. My spirit is. And I want you to, again, speak to your spirit, man. And then I want you to say, I release you to be the leader of my life. And then I want you to quietly tune into the sounds of nature. Just quiet yourself down and tune into the sights and the sounds of nature. We're going doing a little bit more, adding a little bit more to what we did yesterday. And I want you to listen to nature, hear what you see, what you hear, or hear what you hear, and look at the things around you. Look at the spider that's next to you, or the ant, or the tree trunk that's rotten that has woodpecker holes in it, or the color of the water, or the clouds in the sky. Tune into those things. Look at them. Zone in on them. And then I want you to, after you've had a time for a few minutes or a while, just contemplating those things and being finding them to be marvelous and beautiful. I want you then to turn your spirit up to heaven and say, begin to worship the Creator and commune with the Creator, and then get your notepad out and let Him speak to you. Maybe have a conversation. Maybe you'll hear something out of that. And we'll come back together maybe tonight or whenever, and we'll share. Amen?
Come, everyone who thirsts. Come to the waters. Come and eat. Listen diligently to me, and eat what is good.